Hello, this is another video by myself, Lloyd Crooks, and this is looking at the Ecclesiastic text between the East and West traditions. And one of the things, the criticism I normally have of one take critics, it doesn't take into account Christian history or Christian tradition or the text used by the church throughout history. So we're going to go into that, yeah? So you've got the Eastern Church, as those who know Christian history, that there was just one church, and what happened was it split in 1054. The Great Schism, where the East and the West Church split. The West was governed by the Pope, centralized. The Eastern formed in various patriarchal sees throughout the East. So you had one for Egypt, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, so various areas. And they didn't have one centralized government like the church in the West. And this is quite important, as we'll see. So the main center of the Eastern Church, you had Constantinople, which is in Turkey. Um, it was basically the traditional capital. Alexandria, Egypt, known for St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai. Antioch, the church in Antioch. Syrian modern Turkey, Jerusalem, as revered as the birthplace of Christianity. And so those are the main sort of Eastern patriarchal church, but they were autonomous. And that's quite important when we look at Christian history and in textual criticism. So here's a little map of the Eastern Orthodox Church jurisdiction zones and major manuscript centers. So they all had their own scriptoriums. So you had the Serbian, you had the Patriarch of Constantinople, which is known in modern day Turkey, Antioch. Now, just to say that, for example, they don't actually, so for example, Mount Athos, which is in Greece, answered to the Patriarch of Constantinople in Turkey. So, but they were autonomous, and that's quite key. So one of the things where people try to explain away the dominance of the Byzantine tradition is that there was one central, I don't know, order that went out. Um, a lot of scholars don't accept Lucian, but they said there's one order that went out. But we have to understand this is one of the things we want to because it doesn't take into account Christian history, church polity, church structure. The Eastern Church was not like the Western Church. They were independent, they were autonomous. And so they couldn't be out of order. So, for example, you couldn't send out an order from the Patriarch of Constantinople and expect the Patriarch of Antioch to take that order on. So they were independent and they were autonomous. And this is very, very important. You've got the Western Church, which is Rome. Now, in a sense, they operate differently. Now, their language is Latin, Greek actually was Greek. But you've got, in terms of mainly Latin, in the Western side, you've got the Holy Roman Empire, mainly areas like Hungary, modern day Hungary, Romania, those areas, Czechoslovakia, those kind of areas. And but you had one pope who had authority over the whole of the West, but he didn't have authority over the East. So you've got the Mount Athos. Now, here's interesting, it breaks that even further. So even within Mount Athos, you had 20 sovereign self-governing monasteries. So they were independent. So now you like to use an illustration. Say, for example, originally I'm from London, London, England. And so can imagine in London, you've got a number of independent Reformed churches or independent Baptist churches. They don't have the same polity or governance or Pentecostal church. I use that because I'm a Pentecostal myself. So you can have in London quite a number of Pentecostal churches, but they've got their own polity, their own governance. While they may agree on doctrine, they may have their own governance. Yeah. So even in Mount Athos, you had 20 sovereign, self-governing monasteries, and the numbers remain fixed in the Byzantine area. You've got in the west, you've got Monte Cassino in Italy, and they didn't have a dominant center equivalent to Mount Athos, but it was Europe's most popular center for production, preservation, and copying of manuscripts. It reached a golden age in the 11th century under Abbot Vidideus, later Pope Victor III, and he had a famous scriptorium, preserve numerous classical, patristic, and biblical texts. So, so in terms of the process, what I'm going to follow, I'm going to look at Stephanus 1550. So basically, these are texts, printed Greek New Testament, printed texts or adopted texts which were used by the church. So you had Stephanus 1550, Sceptus, the patriarchal texts used by the Greek Orthodox Church. Interesting, they used lectionaries rather than manuscripts. Then you had the Latin Vulgate. And then we're also going to compare it to Nestor-Aland 28. And we're going to look at key doctrinal passages and see how they match up, okay, compared to Nestor-Aland 28. So we've got Matthew 1, verse 7. I could have done verse 7 and 10. So we notice here that the Text Receptus, the patriarchal text, and the Vulgate use Asa. Nestor-Aland use Asa. So the church text really is Asa. Next one, 1 Timothy 3, verse 16. Interesting one. Here's where you see a split between the Eastern and the Western. You've got the Stephanus, except if we use the word God, right, was manifest in the flesh. Patriarchal text still has God manifest in the flesh, but the Vulgate agrees with the Nestor-Aland with who or whom was manifest. Yeah. So we see a split with the Eastern using God and the Western use who or whom. John 9:35. Stephanus, Patriarchal, and Vulgate all agree where Jesus, hearing that he was thrown out of the temple and found him, and he said to him, "Do you believe that I am the Son of God?" That's the church text. Nestor-Aland says, "Son of Man." 1 John 5, verse 7 and 8. Stephanus has this the three that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. These three are one. Petrarch text agrees with that. The Vulgate omits it, along with Nestor-Aland. So here the Western text agrees with what Nestor-Aland. Mark 16, 9 to 20. I just did verse 9, but the Eastern and Western Church use Mark 16, 9 to 20. John 7, verse 8, where Jesus says, "I will not yet go up into the feast. The time of me has not yet been fulfilled." So what you find is that the Vulgate and the Nestor-Aland agree with not. The Eastern says not yet. John 1, verse 18, only begotten Son. What you find is that the church text is Son, where Nestor-Aland says only begotten God. 2 Peter 3, verse 10, probably one of my favorite ones. You know, and this one it's interesting, this one has no manuscript tradition to support it, no manuscripts. So, but the church text is that the East and the West agree in terms of that particular reading. But the Nestor-Aland doesn't even have any manuscript support. One point, the act of adultery, the East and the West, they agree. Nestor-Aland doesn't agree, don't believe it's there. So my conclusion. Evidence presented suggests that many readings found in the modern critical edition texts were not the readings most commonly used within the worship, manuscripts, lectionaries, and theological writings of either Eastern Orthodox or Western Latin churches throughout most of Christian history. Instead, the historic churches generally used readings reflecting the Byzantine tradition, the patriarchal text, textual service, and the Latin Vulgate. So, therefore, from an ecclesiastical history perspective, it may be argued, and it is argued, that the traditional reading represented in the text that was actually received, copied, and read and preached by the church throughout the centuries, whereas many modern critical readings were largely absent from the church's mainstream textual tradition until their adoption by modern critical scholarship in the 19th and 20th century. Now, what breaks down here is interesting. The two main texts that is used by modern text critics are the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But the issue is that Vaticanus had no influence over the Vulgate. Very little influence. It's not used as exemplar. It's an argument I'd constantly use. Why is it that two manuscripts that had little to no influence over the church edition, church text use, why wasn't used as an exemplar? Why wasn't used as an exemplar in the Vatican? Why wasn't Sinaiticus used as an exemplar in St. Catherine's Monastery? So it's interesting that something that's passed throughout history, two manuscripts passed throughout history, and modern textual critics have latched onto these as the best manuscripts, but throughout history, they were never recognized as the best manuscripts. But it takes modern text critics in the last 200 years, say last 200 years, 150 years, to recognize the value of these manuscripts, but no scribe, no church, no one anywhere recognized that text as to be used by the church. So that's my conclusion there. It's a fairly short video for me anyway, but I hope it stirs up your pure mind and I pray be a blessing to you. God bless you and have a lovely night. And it is a lovely evening here in England, nice and warm. Good night.